Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Oren Segal, the director of ADL's Center on Extremism. And today I have the privilege to have a guest here to talk about his new book, Everything You Love Will Burn. Vegas Tenold here to discuss the white nationalist movement, some trends that we're seeing. Tell us a little bit about this book and your sort of approach and how this came about.
Yeah. So it's a result of 6 or 7 years covering the far right as a journalist, just spending, I would say, an unhealthy amount of time with the various creepy crawlies of the far right, National Socialists, KKK, alt-right people, skinheads, going down that rabbit hole 7 years ago and just coming out and trying to figure out what they're about.
In your book, you say that to defeat extremism, you have to understand it.
Yeah.
So in the time that you spent in these, movements, talking to these individuals, what is it that you took out? What is it that you understood that you think is helpful for people who want to push back on this hatred?
Well, I mean, you got to attack it from kind of all angles, right? And sort of first and foremost, if you want to even attempt to defeat extremism, it has to come from from a policy level, like that kind of, it has to come from above. But on a purely personal level, I think it's important that we recognize that not all Nazis have the word racist tattooed on their forehead like Josh Stever in New Jersey has, or wear hoods or that kind of thing. It's important to know that they can look and sound like all of us, and we kind of need to arm ourselves against that a little bit, and we need to understand that they're not necessarily monsters. They have opinions that are monstrous, and we need to. If we come at it with that approach, you can understand it a little bit more. You can try to you can work against it. You have arguments to work against it, and you can also maybe help these guys come back to us a little bit more as well. I mean, people do come back from this movement, and showing a little bit of compassion will maybe help that too.
Yeah. Understanding often means sort of educating, and that means shining a spotlight on extremists and their beliefs and their activity. That's something that we do at ADL every single day. In the past year or so, as the daily news as headlines are dealing with these issues, there has been a discussion about sort of the efficacy of shining a light sometimes too bright, or humanizing the subjects versus exposing them.
I mean, first of all, there's nothing new about the ideology of the quote-unquote alt-right, which is a term I don't really like to use. There's nothing new about what they have to say or what they believe. I mean, Twitter, I guess, is the only new thing. But also, Nazis have worn suits before. So I feel like that's where the importance of understanding comes in. You need to be able to see that where this is coming from and how it has developed.
So what is new? All right. I mean, so this is the question. I mean, we know that people are exposed to this movement, to different factions of this white supremacist or white nationalist movement, and the question is, what is new other than the attention that they're getting? Is it the current, cultural, political climate? Why this book now, and why do so many people care? Based on sort of your in-depth, investigation into this, is there something new here, or is this just repurposing in a different time?
I think, the sentiments of the far right that have remained largely unchanged since Rockwell in the 50s almost. I mean, they're advocating for much the same thing, the ethnic nationalism and that kind of thing. I think it just sort of overlapped with a zeitgeist that seems to be hitting all of the West right now. I mean, the same thing is happening in Europe, the same thing is happening in America. So it's not so much that, these guys managed to infiltrate the mainstream. It's kind of that the mainstream was ready for this kind of message. We seem to be at a point in history right now where populism and xenophobia are easily exploitable themes. I think that's new. I mean, that's obviously it's happened before, and I think also the technology is a huge part of it. I mean, Twitter is almost like the modern day clanhood. It allows you to remain anonymous and feel like you're part of a movement.
like what sense did you get about the sort of the broader sort of blob of social media activists who are trying to weaponize it, who are interested in this? What role do those who are involved, like Heimbach and others, view this sort of faceless mass that might be engaging in their propaganda online? I mean, is it sort of like this is the potential new recruits, and we have to feed the beast until they join us, or how do they sort of view their on-ground activity versus like all the stuff that they know that's happening online?
I think it's been a real challenge for them to know, and we're painting with a broad brush here, but for groups like the Traditionalist Workers' Party or the NSM, who really haven't had much of a presence online at all, it hasn't made much difference in terms of how they work. I mean, they see they see the Twitter sphere as sort of like non-committal, like you said, a blob of I guess potential recruits. And I think for Matthew and for a lot of the people in the book, they saw the potential collaboration with the Spencers of the world and the Enochs as a way to tap into that. But they always saw their hand as being the strongest. I mean, they didn't see it as they needed Spencer's Twitter followers as much as Spencer needed their boots on the ground. But if you ask Spencer, it's of course the other way around. I sat down with Richard Spencer right after the election where we talked about what do you do with this quote-unquote movement that you built, and he said, well, honestly, I don't really know. How do you take this largely anonymous sort of fractious group of Twitter malcontents and turn them into something actionable? And I think that's been their challenge and their goal throughout 2017, and I don't think we've seen a way to do it yet. I mean, I don't think the movement has even grown that much online. If anything, I think it has. The committed members have shrunk because they need to get off Twitter now. They need to join Gab or whatever. So I don't think we haven't seen any successful attempts on capitalizing on this because I think most people are happy being racist on Twitter, and that's about it.
So, one of the sort of post-Charlottesville reactions, it wasn't just sort of social media companies trying to, purge or deal with it differently, but you actually had certain people who were essentially using a tactic often used by these folks, like of doxing, and using it against those who were in attendance, especially these sort of fresh, young faces, people who hadn't necessarily been to a rally before, who all of a sudden their information about their jobs, maybe even where they lived was coming out. And, from our perspective, there are a lot of unintended consequences to that sort of activity. Even, Antifa, while you can say that they oppose these hate groups as ADL and most people in this country, their tactics, may actually end up serving the narrative of white supremacists to make them look like victims. We oppose violence. But I'm just sort of curious how you viewed these, sort of fighting these extremists on that level. And whether you think, not sort of morally whether it's okay or not, but do you think it's actually having an impact on that movement?
I've thought about this quite a lot, and obviously a lot of members left the movement after Charlottesville, not necessarily because their information got public, but because their pictures were in the paper, or because it suddenly got very, very real for a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people just join up because they're bored or they're racist for different reasons. But the second a person died and the spotlight of the national media on them, a lot of them left. Now, doxing, I think, is a very, very dangerous weapon to use.
And ADL has always sort of taken the position that you can't just sort of say that doxing is okay on one side and not the other because it just destroys sort of civility more broadly. But it's a hard sell when there's a teacher who might be a white supremacist who is responsible for kids. People will probably, in that case, appreciate anything that's being done to remove that person.
But look, I mean, I would argue that you can take it up with the school. If you have evidence of this, then show it to the principal or whatever. But it's it's also, I mean, look at me. I'm a white guy in my late 30s. I'm not the first and foremost target of these guys' hatred or their bigotry. So it's very easy for me to sit here and say, look, take the high road. I'm not a minority. I'm not a woman of color. I'm not Jewish. So I don't have much of this rancor leveled at me. So I want to take my own opinions on this with a grain. If you know what I mean.
Sure.
So I get that people's level of sort of being hurt and offended and scared are completely different than my own. So I kind of try to come at this from an efficacy point of view, like what works and what doesn't. And a good example is punching Richard Spencer in the face. It must have felt so good. It must have felt so good for the guy who did it, but it didn't help. If anything, it hurt.
Right, exactly. I mean, that victimization narrative that was then sort of used by him, although he's probably embarrassed by it, but it still doesn't,
Sure.
He was able to rally people around him and say, see, our freedom of speech is being trampled on, and we're being sort of victimized, and I agree. I wanted to ask you about sort of the role specifically of anti-Semitism within these movements. I mean, we obviously know you can't really be an extremist movement without hating the Jews to some level, but I think that one of the sort of moments for a lot of people being Charlottesville, it wasn't just that you had these neo-Nazis and white nationalists and alt-right and all them rallying together, but it's that concept that Jews will not replace us. Because this is a time where, even ADL, we had been reporting on how white supremacists have been emboldened, by the anti-Muslim invective, by the anti-immigrant sentiment, by the misogyny throughout the presidential campaign and afterwards. And, at this seminal moment in time, one of the sort of memorable refrains is the Jews will not replace us. Because the Jews, in the eyes of white supremacists, are responsible for diversity and multiculturalism and immigration and, but...
Feminism even.
Feminism.
Yeah. That was one of the surprises that I had when I was reporting on this book, how sort of profoundly old-fashioned and conspiratorial their anti-Semitism was. They really believe that everything from abortion to immigration and everything in between is somehow being orchestrated by a nefarious cabal of Jewish overlords almost. It's like very much the Zionist occupational government is still a thing. And I think that is a daily thing for them. They don't go around talking about Hitler all day. They don't go around talking about Mexicans all day. But the Jewish threat is in pretty much everything they see and everything they hear, and everything becomes part of that self-reinforcing narrative.
And we cannot forget that every time there's a flyer on campus, every time there's a banner, every time there's an anti-Semitic incident in a community, that it actually provides people and their allies to come together and say, this is not right.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways that's underreported, because pretty much 100% of the time there's more people who oppose neo-Nazis and white nationalists than there are those who are there that support those causes.
I think that's a brilliant point, and I think that's exactly it. I mean, one of the best things that can happen to a person, a young person, is to be offended. Is to be deeply, profoundly offended and decide to do something about it. When I started reporting on this book in 2010, we all thought that the far right wasn't a thing at all. Tea Party was about as extreme as it got, and that was complacent. There's no way to be complacent about this today, because, as you say, the KKK flyers pop up and all this kind of stuff happens. So this is kind of a golden moment for us to rally against this kind of garbage, and for all of us to agree that this is still a thing and the fight isn't over.
Yeah, we need to see hate as an opportunity to fight back, and I think people are seeing that now.
And it's not terrifying. Like if you listen to what Spencer has to say, his arguments are bad. They're not good. They don't make sense. So we can defeat them. We just need to be aware that this is something that people are saying, and then get pissed off about it and rally against it.
Well, I'm ready to get pissed off with you. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks.